Chapter 1. The Chains They Couldn't See. The galactic bazaar of Havana Prime was a festering miracle, gleaming towers built on the bones of lost civilizations, floating in the lower orbit of a gas giant where trade never slept and morality often did. It sprawled in artificial gravity with interlocking rings of markets, auction houses, merchant quarters, slave blocks, and private enclosures, all wrapped in the humming, pulsing heart of neon greed. The station's megastructure spanned miles of corridors and segmented habitats, its underbelly filled with the detritus of trafficking, black market tinkering, and the unspoken truth that behind every glittering display of goods, somewhere a chain rattled in the dark. And among the cages stacked, rusted, and smeared with the fingerprints of every species imaginable was one that held something so painfully small and forgotten, it was almost a cosmic joke that it would one day rewrite the story of the galaxy. The cage was narrow, barely large enough for a grown dog, and its prisoner was barely more than a child, though calling her that didn't even begin to describe the strange elegance of her species. She was an Illyrian, one of the last born under the flickering twilight of the lost moon in Sari, a planet annihilated by pirates during a frontier conflict no one even remembered anymore, and she was not merely a child but a relic of an almost mythical race. Her skin shimmered not because of any cosmetic enhancement, but because her biology reflected light in a way that made her seem dreamlike, ephemeral. Her hair, tangled and matted, was like moonlit silk gone dull from dirt and suffering, and her eyes, those massive, sorrowful amethyst voids, never blinked when people passed by, because blinking would imply she still expected rescue. Her name was Kayla, though she had not heard it spoken with kindness in many rotations, and the slavers who dragged her from system to system often referred to her simply as the Shine, as if she were no more than a lamp they had yet to sell. Her chains were deceptively small, nanosilk lined with neural inhibitors, but what truly imprisoned her wasn't the metal, it was the silence. The long, grinding silence of not being spoken to, not being touched unless for examination, not being given anything beyond what was needed to survive in misery. She had learned, at the hand of her first owner, what screaming earned her, and by the third she'd stopped doing it even in her dreams. Now she simply sat curled in the corner of her cage, arms wrapped around thin legs, eyes flickering whenever light passed over her. The slaver who owned her now, Trask, a bulbous Darvik with slime-seeping jowls and thick fur mats clinging to his shoulders, kept her in the front row because her exoticness attracted curious glances. But no one bought her, not because she was unworthy, but because people feared what she was. Illyrians were believed to be touched by the flow, a natural psychic force not yet understood, and to some, that meant purchasing one would invite curses or madness. And so, she sat through endless cycles, listening to the rattle of credits, the shouts of bargaining, the sobs of other slaves brought in and rotated out like merchandise. Some wept, some fought, some begged to be killed, but Kayla did none of these. She watched. She memorized faces. She listened to the vibrations of emotions in the air. And she dreamed, sometimes, though it pained her, of open sky, of wind on her face, of her mother's lullabies sung in a language lost to most databanks. But no one ever looked into her cage long enough to see her as a person, until the day that changed everything. His name was Howrick Strand, and he had no idea he was about to become a legend. Howrick had once been a war engineer, not a soldier, but the kind who built things soldiers used to kill and survive the siege walkers on Durith 7, the cryo fortresses on Velos Prime, the mine-detecting drones that skittered across ice worlds no longer charted on galactic maps. But all of that was before he burned out, before his brother died in the siege of Ekros, and Howrick realized he was just a cog in a wheel that ground people into ash. He dropped his badge, left his contract with the Coalition Military Corps, and wandered. For 3 years he worked odd repair jobs, hopping from one derelict colony to the next, bartering repairs for food, sometimes for a place to sleep. It wasn't penance, he told himself, but something quieter, something that made the guilt hurt less. And so he ended up on Havana Prime, in a dusty back corridor of the lower markets, searching for a part for a broken atmospheric valve on a shuttle he was fixing for a mining crew. He had no reason to stray from his path that day, no reason to stop. And yet, when he passed the cage, something primal slammed into him like a bolt of heat. He didn't understand what he was looking at first, just a glimmer in the corner of his vision, something reflective, a flicker of violet and silver behind rusted bars. He turned, curious, and there she was. Kayla. She didn't blink. She didn't move. She simply looked at him, really looked at him, and in that moment, Howrick felt like he'd been weighed. Not judged, not condemned, but seen. Like a soul caught in the tractor beam of something beyond science. It broke something in him, something he hadn't realized was still brittle. He stepped closer, ignoring the growl from Trask, who barked something about not touching the merchandise. Howrick crouched in front of the cage and spoke the first real words Kayla had heard in years. "You okay, kid?" he asked. Kayla didn't respond with words. She simply tilted her head, blinked once, and then very slowly reached forward through the bars. Not begging, not grasping, just acknowledging. Howrick stared at the tiny hand. So delicate, so thin, and around her wrist, the shimmer of a restraint that hummed faintly with energy. He recognized it instantly: military-grade inhibitor cuffs, the kind designed for telepaths. Something clicked in his brain then, something cold and angry and sharp, and it was as though the air shifted. Howrick stood and turned to Trask. "How much for the girl?" he asked. Trask laughed, a wheezing, mucus-filled snort. "Not for sale," he said. "She's display. Creeps bring customers to my better stock. You want a Clintari breeder or a Terran hybrid? Got fresh ones, still have their original teeth." Howrick didn't budge. "I said how much?" Trask scowled, his mini eyes narrowing. "Listen, human. I don't like your tone. Walk away." Howrick's voice dropped to something deadly. "You're using coalition military restraints. That's illegal in this quadrant." Trask paled slightly. Howrick continued, calm and cold. "I can report you. The authorities don't usually care, but I know who to call to make them care." Trask sputtered, then snarled. "Fine. 50,000 credits." Howrick didn't blink. He tossed a chip on the table. Done. The next hour was a blur of bureaucracy and threats. Howrick called in an old favor to make the paperwork move, and when Trask tried to remove the inhibitors, Howrick insisted on doing it himself. He knelt in front of Kayla, whispered softly, "It's okay now," and began deactivating the neural locks with the manual override code he remembered from his military days. When the last one clicked off, something happened. Kayla inhaled just once, and the entire room seemed to still. Not from magic, not from power, but from the weight of silence that suddenly broke. It was as if the universe had taken a breath with her. Howrick carried her out of the cage, wrapped her in a clean cloth he'd bought from a nearby vendor, and held her close. She didn't cry. She didn't speak. But her tiny fingers gripped his shirt with a strength that made his heart squeeze. He didn't understand why he'd done it. He didn't know what would come next. All he knew was this: no one should ever be left in a cage like that. Especially not a child. Especially not someone who had eyes like Kayla's. They walked out of the bazaar together, one man and one small alien girl, their shadows stretching side by side on the dusty corridor floor. And though neither of them knew it yet, the galaxy had just shifted on its axis. Because Kayla was more than a slave. More than a child. She was the last seed of a dying star. And Howrick Strand, the broken human with nothing left, had just planted hope in a soil no one believed could grow anything ever again. Howrick didn't speak as they made their way through the winding arteries of Havana Prime's lower levels. The girl still cradled in his arms like something fragile and irreplaceable. She barely moved except for her steady grip on his jacket, her breathing quiet, but now present, more rhythmic, less shallow, as if every meter further from the cage stitched a bit of her spirit back into the pale shell of her body. The station around them pulsed with life, vendors shouting, cargo droids clanking down metallic corridors, the occasional distant burst of plasma fire from some dispute in a darker alley, but Howrick only heard the whisper of her presence, that eerie stillness in her that made her feel more like a living thought than flesh and bone. His mind raced with questions. What now? Where would they go? Who would come looking? He didn't have the answers, only the clarity of a choice that had already been made. He had touched a fracture in the universe, and now there was no turning away from it. He took her to the dockyard hangar where he had been staying, a rust-scarred service bay built into the belly of an old hull, home to forgotten ships and stripped-down salvage rigs. There, among coils of cables and half-dismantled engine parts, sat the only real asset Howrick still owned, an old long-range skiff named the Meander. It was a boxy, outdated model with mismatched plating, patched sensor pods, and a power core held together by stubbornness and a prayer, but it flew, and it was his. He brought her inside, lowered her gently onto the padded cot in the crew berth, and closed the ramp behind them. She watched him silently the entire time, as if measuring every movement, deciding if this new cage was better than the last. But then, as Howrick turned to begin gathering medical supplies and food, she spoke. One word, a single syllable in a voice that was soft, high, and cracked from disuse. Name. Howrick froze. He turned slowly, his eyes locking with hers. My name? He asked. She nodded. Howrick, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Howrick Strand. She blinked once, then said, Kayla. That was it. No title, no surname, no proud name of a clan or system. Just Kayla. He nodded and whispered, Nice to meet you, Kayla. Even as something sharp twisted in his chest because he understood no one had asked her name in years. No one had given her the dignity of identity. That was what they had stripped from her, perhaps more than freedom. And now, in this quiet ship built from scrap and soot, she was reclaiming it. Howrick spent the next few hours checking her for injury, small bruises, the raw scars around her wrists from the inhibitors, malnourishment so advanced it made his hands tremble, but nothing beyond what could be treated with time, nutrition, and gentleness. He fed her rehydrated vegetable soup, offered her clean water, and wrapped her in one of his old engineering coats like a blanket. She didn't resist, didn't flinch, but there was something unnerving in how quiet she remained. No crying, no outbursts. It wasn't stoicism, it was survival. The kind learned only by those who'd seen the worst of people and still endured. That night, Howrick didn't sleep. He sat beside her berth, tinkering with a busted sensor relay while the ship hummed quietly, and occasionally glanced at her to make sure she was still breathing. Somewhere deep in his gut, a truth began to take root. Kayla wasn't just someone he had rescued. She was someone the galaxy had buried. And now that she was free, there would be those who wanted her back. The kind of people who didn't forgive broken contracts. The kind of people who would burn half a moon to retrieve their property. Chapter 2, Whispers in the Flow. It was 3 days before Kayla spoke more than a few words at a time, and even then, they came like tiny snowflakes, delicate, fleeting, filled with meaning too vast for their size. Howrick didn't push. He answered every question simply, sometimes repeating himself when she asked the same thing twice in different ways, as if she were testing whether he would lie. Why help me? She asked once, curled up on the cot with a repaired blanket pulled over her legs, eyes never leaving his. Howrick paused, tool in hand, and said, Because you were in chains, and I had the key. She didn't smile. Kayla never smiled, but her eyes blinked slower, which he had begun to recognize as her version of agreement. They drifted through the rimward sectors, docking only at minor outposts with minimal surveillance, avoiding coalition checkpoints and major space lanes. Howrick filed no flight plan. He was trying to disappear, even though part of him knew it was already too late. On the 4th day, he found a bounty listing under his name — unlawful acquisition of restricted sentient property, backed by a private syndicate that traced directly to Trask's slaver ring. That wasn't what worried him. What worried him was the second listing. Kayla's image, grainy but unmistakable, listed as a classy biological anomaly. No price, no owner, just the note. Return with discretion. Do not engage without authority. That meant they didn't want her harmed. That meant she was worth more than a slave. That meant her secret hadn't just been her species, it was her power. And on the 7th night, he saw a glimpse of it. They had just finished eating, if warming ration packs could be called that, and Kayla had dozed off wrapped in a blanket in the co-pilot's chair, while Howrick ran diagnostics. He was about to shut down the console when he felt a shift in the air, a prickling along his spine. He turned and saw her eyes open, glowing faintly. A violet hue shimmered over her skin, and for a second, he could hear a sound that didn't come from any speaker, a whisper, like breath across glass, forming words not spoken aloud but etched directly into the mind. The dark is coming. He froze. Her lips didn't move, but her thoughts were everywhere, in his ears, behind his eyes, wrapping around his heartbeat. You unchain me. Now I must stay unbroken. Howrick knelt in front of her. What are you? He asked gently. Kayla blinked and whispered, I was born near the flow. The flow, according to ancient Illyrian myth, Was the living current of the universe the thread that tied time, space, and thought into one tapestry? It wasn't science. It wasn't religion. It was deeper. Illyrians had always been believed to be able to brush against it, but Kayla wasn't brushing it. She was swimming in it. "Can you read minds?" he asked. She shook her head. "Only what people scream inside." The simplicity of the phrase broke him in half. He understood now her silence hadn't just been trauma. She had heard too much. She had been forced to listen to the thoughts of cruel men for years. And she hadn't been a child, they had made her a mirror for their darkness. The decision came quickly after that. They couldn't keep running. Somewhere, someone would track her. Someone with scanners, drones, or worse. They needed help. Howrick had avoided calling in real favors. But there was one man who owed him his life, a half-cybernetic rogue named Kestrin Vol, who operated in the old ruins of the Lorne Expanse. If anyone could hide Kayla, it was Vol. But Vol didn't offer help for free, and Howrick knew that showing up with a girl marked as a Class E biological anomaly would complicate everything. Still, they had no choice. As the skiff turned its nose toward the uncharted coordinates of the Expanse, Kayla stirred beside him. "You're taking me to someone?" she asked. "Yes," Howrick said. "A friend. He might help." She nodded. "Good." Then she looked out the viewport and whispered, "The dark is following us." He almost asked what she meant, but he didn't. Because in his gut, he knew. They weren't just running from slavers. They were running from something much older. Something that remembered the Illyrians. Something that didn't want Kayla free. And somewhere, deep in the void, something else awakened. Watching. Listening. Waiting. The journey to the Lorne Expanse wasn't charted on any current navigational software. Most ships veered away from that sector not because of pirates or black holes, but because of the old stories rumors of censored ghosts, derelict battlefields filled with weapons that still burn minds instead of hulls, and an ever-present sense of being watched. It was the kind of place only desperate or half-mad people visited, which made it the perfect hiding place for someone like Kestrin Vol. Howrick had once saved Vol's life during a breach event on a fortress moon where a misfired particle weapon had cooked half the station's reactor core. He dragged the mercenary out of a collapsing pressure shaft, while alarms blared and atmosphere rushed into the void. Vol had promised then that he'd repay the debt dash, one ship-sized favor, he'd said. Howrick had never intended to cash it in. Until Kayla. They crossed into the outer belt of the Expanse as space grew quieter, darker, as if sound itself had forgotten how to echo. Asteroids floated like broken teeth, and ancient debris fields shimmered with residual energy that even Howrick's instruments refused to fully register. Kayla stood near the viewport most of the time, not asking questions, her eyes reflecting starlight in a way that made her seem like a child-shaped window to something much older than memory. She didn't speak much, but when she did, her words never landed lightly. "This place remembers pain," she said once, and Howrick looked up from the console, shivering without knowing why. "You can feel that?" he asked. She turned slowly. "Not feel. Listen." Like old songs playing backwards. Eventually, they found the coordinates an asteroid that had been hollowed out and reinforced with patchwork metal plates, heat diffusers, and concealed docking ports. A dozen ships orbited the mass, each of them scavenger class or worse, yet heavily modified. Clearly someone with dangerous taste had been tinkering with them. Howrick keyed in the old code Vol had given him years ago and waited. A pulse returned access granted. The outer gate opened with a low moan, the docking tunnel extending like a mechanical tongue toward the meander. Howrick looked at Kayla, who simply nodded, and they crossed the threshold. Inside, the asteroid smelled of ozone, coolant, and old metal, a place where the air scrubbers had been replaced too many times, and everything felt alive in a mechanical way. Vol met them at the end of the tunnel, his lower body a heavy bipedal exosuit that hissed and clicked with each step, his upper body wrapped in dark mesh armor and threaded with interface jacks. His left eye was human. His right was a glowing orb of amber circuitry. "Howrick Strand," he said with a half-smirk. "I thought you were dead, or worse, married." Howrick didn't smile. "This is Kayla." He didn't offer explanation beyond that. Vol looked at the girl for a long time. Then he said, "She's the reason you came here." Howrick nodded. "She needs protection. Off-grid. Away from all eyes. You still good for one favor?" Vol grunted and waved a hand. Yeah. Follow me." But you better tell me what she really is before I start getting dreams of my own head exploding. As they walked through the winding halls of the facility past old surveillance pods, engine parts, and walls etched with hand-scrawled schematics, Kayla remained close to Howrick, her hand occasionally brushing his. It wasn't fear. It was tethering. She was grounding herself to him, like a ship anchoring to a known port while sailing in unknown storms. Vol led them to a private chamber lined with signal blockers and plasma-insulated doors. He sealed it from the inside, sat heavily on a reinforced chair, and stared at Howrick. "So," he said, "what's she worth?" Howrick looked away. "That's the wrong question." Kayla's voice came then, soft and sure. "They don't want me back because of who I am. They want me back because of what I remember." Vol's artificial eye flickered. "You're what, a psychic databank?" Kayla tilted her head. "When I touch people, sometimes I see what they forget, what they hide, what they fear." Vol frowned. "So they're scared of you?" Kayla nodded. "Because I know where the scream began." That made both men go quiet. Later, when Kayla had fallen asleep in a cot, Vol provided her tiny frame curled into a bundle of oversized fabric and warmth. Howrick and Vol sat in the adjoining chamber, drinking recycled steam brew and watching old star charts flicker on a projector. Howrick finally explained what he knew about the inhibitors, the bounty listings, the flow, and the strange whispers she'd sent into his mind. Vol listened, growing more serious by the minute. "There's a group," he said finally, "operating under the name the Syndic. No face, no leaders, but they buy and collect anomaly psychics, precogs, rare biology, you name it. They don't sell. They archive. Lock away. Some say they're trying to reverse engineer life itself." He took a long sip and stared into the cup. If Kayla came from one of their vaults, then she wasn't just a slave. She was an experiment. Howrick clenched his jaw. "They treated her like a lab rat." "No," Vol corrected. "They treated her like a puzzle they couldn't solve. That makes her 10 times more dangerous to them now, especially if she's unlocked." "Unlocked?" Vol leaned forward. "You think she's using her full ability?" "No. She's just starting. And whatever she's seeing, whatever memories or threads she's unraveling, she's going to start broadcasting soon. Not on purpose, but the flow doesn't like to stay quiet." As if to confirm this, the lights dimmed momentarily, and one of Vol's surveillance consoles sparked without reason. He looked toward the ceiling. "Too late to hide her now," he muttered. Howrick stood. "Then help me move her. Train her. Something. I won't let them take her back." Vol sighed, his mechanical limbs hissing. "I'll call in a few markers. Find an old war monk I know. She'll need discipline if her mind's going to survive what's coming." Howrick nodded. "And me?" Vol smirked. "You? You're already committed. You're the guy who broke her chains. You think that's the end?" "No. That was just the spark." From the shadows of the corridor, Kayla stood silently, watching them. She hadn't been sleeping. She had heard every word. And as she turned back toward her makeshift room, the lights flickered once again, just slightly, just enough for the sensors to stutter. And for a moment, in the reflection of the steel door, her eyes weren't violet. They were gold, burning like memory made fire. The following days passed like echoes inside a chamber that had only just remembered sound. Within the metallic bones of the hollowed asteroid, time bent itself around a girl rediscovering her voice and a man rediscovering his purpose. Vol had cleared a section of the hideout's inner vaults to become Kayla's sanctuary, a chamber walled with psi dampeners and lined with memory-neutral insulation, designed not to suppress her growth, but to keep her presence from bleeding out into space, where listening minds could pluck her from the void like a flare in darkness. It was a cage of another kind, but this one was padded with choice, with safety, and Kayla didn't recoil from it. In fact, when Howrick showed her the space, she simply nodded and said, "It's quiet here. I like it." Vol brought in a woman on the 6th day, a tall, blue-skinned Ilvari known only as Seraph, her body draped in flowing neural weave garments, her eyes bioluminescent slits that shimmered with wisdom earned through pain. She was not a teacher in the traditional sense. She was what the forgotten sects of Illyrians used to call a threadwalker, someone who didn't just interact with the flow, but lived inside its pull, letting its currents guide speech, movement, and emotion. She did not bow. She did not kneel. She approached Kayla slowly, gently, and extended a single hand. "You've been touched by silence too long," she said. "Let's teach you how to speak without hurting." Howrick had expected Kayla to shy away, to retreat into herself, but she surprised him. She reached out, pressed her palm to Saratha's, and whispered, "Show me." The training began immediately, but it wasn't drills or lectures, it was stillness. It was meditation inside soundless rooms. It was drawing ancient glyphs in the air and watching them unravel into threads of color only Kayla could see. It was Sarath asking Kayla to listen to the whisper of gravity, to the murmur of past footsteps embedded in floors, to the weight of thought suspended in stale air. "You're not broken," Sarath told her during one session. "You're echoing. We just need to shape the echo." Meanwhile, Halric worked beside Vol to upgrade the meander. He didn't know what they were preparing for, only that they had to be ready when the galaxy noticed the noise Kayla was making. Vol's facility became a forge. Plasma rails were installed, stealth matrices re-etched, backup AI routines coded in triplicate. Kayla wasn't just a passenger, now she was a beacon. Halric didn't say it aloud, but part of him believed that if she ever truly called out across the stars, worlds would shift in orbit to answer. And sure enough, the signs of pursuit began to emerge, strange encrypted pings brushing their system perimeter, courier drones scavenging comm buoys near the expanse, mercenaries with fake IDs arriving at nearby fringe posts, asking too many questions. The Syndic was moving, not fast, but like a glacier, slow, inevitable, unrelenting. Then, one night, Kayla stood in Halric's quarters, barefoot, her eyes wide and strangely calm. "I saw it," she said. Halric sat up instantly from his makeshift bunk. "What did you see?" She didn't blink. "The place they made me forget. It's not just a lab. It's a tomb. But not of dead things. Of sleeping ones." He stared at her, unsure how to respond, but Kayla continued, her voice softer now, distant. "And they're waking up. Because I'm awake." That was the night Halric decided to stop hiding. Chapter 3, where the chains were forged. The old moon of Kirill 6 wasn't on most star maps anymore. It had once been a mining satellite orbiting a rogue planet in the Veil Drift, but the operation went bankrupt 3 decades ago, and the coalition marked the whole region as unstable due to frequent gravitational anomalies. Halric had been there once years ago, on a recovery job. The mines were deep, carved into ice-laced bedrock, and the central control towers had collapsed inward after the company tried to extract volatile core energy from beneath a frozen sea. It was the kind of place no one bothered to patrol anymore. Perfect for secrets. Perfect for ghosts. And that's where Kayla wanted to go. "I saw it again," she told Sarath one morning, her voice steadier now, her eyes more awake. "They kept my memories there. In the dark, in a vault of screaming lights. I want to see it with my own eyes." Sarath hesitated. "You don't have to return to pain to grow beyond it." But Kayla shook her head. "They want me to forget. If I remember everything, they lose." Halric supported her decision without question. He had seen enough in her visions to believe this wasn't about escape anymore. It was about confrontation. About breaking the machine that had forged her chains in the first place. They left the asteroid base in the meander, now fully upgraded, its engines humming with renewed strength and shields whisper thin but resilient. Vol had given them a burner AI named Turn, a sardonic voice that spoke in clipped tones and did not hesitate to offer unsolicited tactical advice. Sarath accompanied them, sitting in quiet meditation most hours of the journey, sometimes placing her hands gently against the bulkheads as if listening to the ship's dreams. Kayla spent the flight drawing symbols in the condensation on the viewports, humming softly in a language Halric didn't understand but felt in his teeth like vibration. They traveled for 5 days through hyperspace folds and dark corridors of space, where stars blinked like the dying eyes of long-forgotten gods. When they arrived at Kirill 6, the moon was exactly as Halric remembered, cold, jagged, silent. The atmosphere was breathable but thin, and the surface was covered in layers of ice that fractured beneath their boots like glass. They descended into the mine using the old emergency lifts, the walls scarred with burn marks from past collapses, and the occasional warnings scribbled in forgotten dialects. As they moved deeper, Kayla's pace quickened not with fear, but with certainty. She knew the way. They found the vault behind a false wall of rock, sealed with a hex-locked plate that Kayla deactivated simply by placing her hand upon it. The metal shimmered, dissolved into light, and behind it lay a room of horrors. Halric had seen torture rooms, war bunkers, even Blacksite Labs, but nothing prepared him for this. The chamber was filled with containment cylinders, each housing a strange suspension of glowing particulate that writhed as they entered. Floating inside were neural strands, memories, dreams, echoes of minds extracted and frozen. Kayla walked between them like someone moving through the pages of her own torn diary. "They took thoughts," she said, her fingers trembling. "Not just mine. Others. Illyrians. Even humans. They stored pieces. Trapped them. Tested which ones could survive without bodies." Sereth inhaled sharply. "They were harvesting consciousness." Kayla nodded. "To build something that doesn't forget. Ever." In the center of the room stood a console, cold, silent, but still operational. Kayla approached it, touched a single glyph, and the room came alive with light. Visions flickered across the walls, her memories playing out like fractured reflections. Her childhood, her capture, the experiments, the pain, and then something else. A face. Not human, not Illyrian. A species unknown to them, gray skin, 3 vertical eyes, and a voice like steel scraping frost. Project ORYN. Subject Kayla, stability failure projected. Recommend final extraction within cycle 917. Then it vanished. Kayla turned to Howrick. "That's who made the chains." And that's when the sirens began. The Syndic had found them. The warning klaxons that erupted through the old mining vault were not the kind meant for workers. They were newer, sharper, laced with synthesized urgency, and they weren't wired into the structure. They were embedded in the stone, projected through microfilament networks laid like veins through the moon's crust. It was a listening post. The entire moon, long presumed abandoned, had been converted into a trap, an echoing tomb still loyal to its masters. Seretha's eyes flashed wide with alarm as she pulled Kayla away from the central console, her voice urgent but steady. "We must leave. Now." Howrick had already drawn his sidearm, though he knew it was more symbolic than practical. If the Syndic had activated the system, they were already surrounded. But Kayla did not run. She stood in the heart of the memory chamber, the images still flickering across the walls in their haunting loop, her fingers trembling not with fear, but with resolve. "No," she whispered. "They need me to run. That's how they follow. That's how they win." Howrick turned toward her, caught in the war between protection and belief. "We don't have the firepower to hold this place, Kayla. We need to regroup. We need to dash." But she raised a hand. Not to silence him, but to still the very air. "They think I'm still what they made. That I don't remember who I am beyond the tests. But I was never theirs. I was my mother's before I was anything. I remember her now. Her voice. Her song. And she said I would wake the sky." The walls around them pulsed. The console sparked. And then, impossibly, the particles suspended in the memory tanks began to coalesce, threads of thought, tethered to her like moths to a flame. Kayla's body shimmered with bioluminescent radiance, the shimmer of her skin now an aurora of defiance. Sereth stepped back in awe. "She's not reaching into the flow," she whispered. "She's pulling it through her." And that was when the Syndic came. They did not enter with brute force or fire and thunder. They simply arrived, 3 figures emerging from light and dust at the edge of the vault, humanoid in shape, but taller, leaner, robed in layered shadows, with faces obscured by porcelain-white masks etched with untranslatable glyphs. Behind them hovered a singular drone the size of a transport pod, humming with energy that caused Howrick's weapon to short out on his belt before he could raise it. One of the figures spoke, not aloud but within the mind, a whisper so cold it burned. "Return the anomaly. You will not be harmed." Kayla stepped forward, her eyes glowing. "You bound me in silence," she said. "But I heard everything, even your secrets." One of the masked figures shuddered, as if touched by something it had long forgotten. Another reached out. "You are incomplete. You are a fragment. Come back, and we will make you whole." Kayla took a breath. The air crystallized in her lungs. "I am already whole," she said. "You just carved pieces off me and kept them in glass." Then the chamber exploded in light. Not fire, not plasma, but thought. Kayla's presence expanded not just her body, but herself, unfurling through the room like a tidal force of everything she had reclaimed. The memory tanks shattered, but instead of chaos, there was music, thousands of voices, layered in harmony, the dreams and echoes of lives long extinguished now set free. The Syndic figures faltered. The drone began to vibrate uncontrollably before blinking out of existence. The very structure of the chamber groaned under the psychic pressure. Howrick shielded his eyes, but through the radiance, he saw her, Kayla, standing as if the world had become wind, and she was the eye of a great storm, her hair rising in weightless arcs, her skin glowing like a moonlit flame, and her chains those terrible memories of silence falling away like dust in sunrise. Sareth reached for her. Kayla, you must breathe. Pull it back, or you'll burn yourself out. And Kayla turned to her, nodded once, and whispered, I choose what stays. And then, with an exhale that seemed to shake the foundations of the moon, she closed her eyes, and the light faded. When it was done, the vault was in ruins. The Syndic were gone, whether destroyed or fled, no one could tell. The memory strands had vanished into the ether, and only the three of them remained. Howrick, kneeling and dazed, Sareth weeping silently, and Kayla, smiling. For the first time. Chapter 4. The Sky She Woke. They left Kirill, 6 in silence, the moon collapsing slowly behind them as tremors shook its surface, no longer able to hold the weight of what had been hidden within it. The meander cut through space like a whisper, guided now by more than turns coordinates. Kayla stood at the helm, her presence not just aboard the ship but in it, woven into its electronic systems, its navigational threads, its sensors. She had not become something divine, but something seen, something reclaimed. Howrick had expected her to retreat after the confrontation, to grow quiet again, but she had done the opposite. She had grown louder, not in speech, but in aura. The flow moved around her now, not just through her. She was gravity with a heartbeat. They traveled toward the outer colonies, where whispers of uprisings had begun to surface, small revolts against the Syndic's hidden arm, rogue elements leaking stolen archives, communities protecting runaways. Kayla asked to go there, not to run, but to help. There are more, she said. Like me. Forgotten. Broken. I can find them now. Sareth became her guide, Howrick her protector, though both roles blurred with time. No longer teacher and guardian. They became companions of something greater, Kayla's truth. And as her strength returned, so did her power to influence what surrounded her. Howrick saw it in small ways. A broken engine sparking to life when she touched it, wounded animals calming in her presence, frightened children no longer crying when she looked at them. Vol joined them later, bringing news of the Syndic's panic, entire databanks purged, drones recalled, laboratories destroyed by their own hands. They're scared, he told Howrick, leaning against the skiff's mainframe. Not of her power, but of the idea of her, of what she represents. Howrick nodded. She's proof they can't control everything. Vol smirked. That scares people more than war ever could. Kayla never boasted, never declared vengeance. She simply moved forward one step at a time, unbreaking the galaxy as she went. And Howrick, who had once believed his hands could only build machines of war, now built schools, shelters, and new homes on forgotten worlds, using his tools to craft beginnings instead of ends. Sareth taught others how to listen to the flow without fear. And Kayla? She stood where she was needed. Sometimes in a quiet village. Sometimes in the heart of a rebellion. Always watching. Always remembering. And on one quiet day, years later, a child asked her what her name meant. Kayla knelt, smiled, and said, "It means the sky that remembers." Because she was never just a girl. She was the song the chains couldn't silence. And the galaxy had only just begun to sing with her. The shimmer of Kayla's skin intensified until it no longer seemed like light reflected, but light created a radiance that did not come from the stars outside, nor the ruined technology buried beneath Kirill 6, but from within her, as if her entire being had become a prism through which ancient energy refracted. Howrick could hardly look away. He had seen detonation bursts and quantum flares during wartime, but nothing prepared him for the gentle, impossible brightness of a girl claiming the pieces of her stolen self. The particles suspended in the memory tanks surged toward her, drifting through the air like streams of thought unspooling, and as they brushed her skin, they sank into her one by one until the tanks were empty, their contents returned to their source. Kayla didn't scream. She didn't falter. She simply stood with her arms slightly out, her head tilted upward, and her eyes, once violet, now glowed gold like twin suns reborn. Sareth dropped to her knees, not out of submission, but reverence. Even the monk who had walked the flow her entire life had never seen such complete reclamation. She is no longer in the current, Sereth whispered, her voice breaking. She is the current now. But there was no time for awe. From the tunnels behind them, the thudding of armored boots grew louder. Not the disorderly noise of mercenaries, but the synchronized stomp of Syndic Enforcer soldiers bioengineered to resist psionics, armored in psi-reflective alloys, and trained to extract anomalies by any means necessary. They moved in with formation precision, and ahead of them floated a command drone oval-shaped, silent, projecting a crackling voice that echoed through the chamber. Subject Kayla, return to stasis. You are property of Archive Division 0. Compliance is survival. Non-compliance is termination. Howrick raised his rifle, but even he knew it wouldn't matter. These weren't scavengers or bounty hunters. This was the real hand of the Syndic, cold, clinical, and terribly exact. But Kayla wasn't afraid. She stepped forward, her bare feet kissing the frozen floor as she advanced toward the soldiers. Her hands didn't glow. She didn't summon fire or fury. She simply spoke. I am not your subject. I am not your anomaly. You cut me into pieces, and I remember every blade, every cage, every number you wrote where my name should be. But you didn't erase me. You preserved me. You kept everything I was so I could bring it back. And now I bring it to you. The soldiers hesitated. Their leader didn't. The command drone surged forward, projecting a disruptive field meant to destabilize thought forms and overload memory. It had worked on a dozen rogue Illyrians before. It was built for this. But Kayla didn't flinch. Instead, she raised one hand slowly, and the pulse stopped. Not paused. Not redirected. Ceased. The lights in the drone flickered, then dimmed. The metal casing around its core grew cold. Its voice stuttered. Then without fanfare it fell, hitting the stone floor with a hollow clank. The soldiers reacted immediately, raising weapons, activating shields, scattering into attack formations. But Kayla didn't move. She spoke, not with words, but with memory. It surged outward from her body in a wave invisible to the eyes, but undeniable in impact. Each soldier staggered not from impact, but from remembrance. Because she didn't just project pain, she projected truth. In their minds, they saw what she saw, felt the loneliness, the steel walls, the needles, the cold of forgotten moons, and the echo of every experiment run without consent. It wasn't an attack. It was empathy used as a blade. The strongest among them screamed. The weakest dropped their weapons and wept. None advanced. And then Kayla looked toward Howrick. It's done here, she said softly. We don't need to fight anymore. Sereth rose beside her. They will come again. I know, Kayla whispered. But not here. Not like this. Because I am no longer lost. They cannot steal what I remember. Howrick exhaled. He lowered his weapon and walked to her side. Then let's go home. But Kayla shook her head. There's more to do. Others like me. Caged. Hiding. Not knowing what they are. I can hear them now. Faint. Afraid. But they're calling. You want to save them? He asked, already knowing the answer. She nodded. And Howrick, once just a broken mechanic, once a man who only knew how to fix parts, realized that he had become part of something living. Not a mission. Not a war. A rescue. A promise that even the smallest voice could shake a galaxy. They left Kirill, 6 behind. Its vaults empty now, the memories no longer echoing through stone but alive in the heart of a girl who had once been just a cage of silence. Epilogue. The girl who was memory. Years passed. Across the spiral arms of the galaxy, whispers began to circulate. Not of armies. Not of revolutions. But of freeings. Outposts raided not for profit, but for liberation. Laboratories cracked open and their captives empaths, clairvoyants, soul readers led into light by a child who never seemed to age, whose eyes shimmered gold, and who always walked beside a human man with grease on his jacket and calluses on his hands. They were not rebels. They were reminders that no being was too small to matter, no voice too silent to echo, and no chain so tight it could not be broken. And in the silence between stars, Kayla listened. Not for enemies, but for hope. Because once, a human broke her chains. And now, she would break them for the rest.